So now we're going to continue talking about child development with Module 14, Infancy and Childhood. So infancy is newborns growing into almost toddlers. So this is kind of the first year of life. And then childhood is toddlers growing into teenagers. And for each of these stages, we will talk about brain development, motor development, cognitive development, and social emotional development. Maturation, not the meaning you might think. In psychology, maturation refers to the changes that occur primarily because of the passage of time. In developmental psychology, maturation refers to biologically driven growth and developmental enabling orderly changes in behavior, so behavior that are kind of predictable. So, from a baby lying to sitting to standing to walking. So, experience, the nurture part of it, can adjust the timing, but maturation, nature sets the sequence. For example, my daughter was able to, actually my daughter never crawled. She went right from sitting to walking, and she started walking at 9 months. My two boys did crawl, and my first boy walked at 12 months and the other one at 14 months. So there was wide variability even within my children, but there was definitely a progression that they lifted their heads, sat up, and then either crawled or went right to walking. So maturation in infancy and early childhood affects the brain and motor skills. So we'll see it both in brain development and motor development. So in the womb, the number of neurons grows by about 750,000 new cells per minute in the middle trimester. Can you imagine that? Like, that's an incredible amount of growth. Beginning at birth, the connections among neurons proliferate. And so these are the, how we make the connections, as we talked about in our learning and our memory and intelligence. So as we learn, more branches and neural networks are formed, and that's what's happening during childhood. So in infancy, during the first year of life, the growth in the neural connections takes place initially in the less complex parts of the brain, like the brainstem and limbic system, as well as the motor and sensory strip. And this enables for the basic survival skills. But in early childhood, as the kid in the first year of life, the neural connections proliferate in the association areas, and this enables advances in controlling attention and behavior in the frontal lobes, as well as thinking, memory, and language. So the maturation takes place in the body in the cerebellum, which is a little brain at the bottom of the skull, enabling the sequence below. So generally, kids are able to sit up by 6 months. They crawl between 8 and 12 months. They begin to walk, 8 and 9 months are crawling, begin to walk around 12 months, and they're walking independently by 5 months. So you can train your child, but you generally can't make them do these things much faster. A lot of it just depends kind of on the child. So we talked a little bit in our memory section about infantile amnesia. So in infancy, babies form memories that are different than the episodic memories we form in adulthood, because they don't have the language and they don't have the recall capacity in the first year of life. So a birthday party when turning 3 might be the person's first memory. But we know that babies can learn skills, and those are procedural memories. So this 3-month-old can learn and recall a month later that specific foot movements move specific mobiles. So they can make that association and remember that, but they don't have specific, episodic memories, so that, they will not recall later on in life being able to do that. When we talk about cognitive development, cognition refers to the mental activities that help us function, including problem solving, figuring out how the world works, developing models and concepts, storing and retrieving knowledge, understanding and using language, and using self-talk and inner thoughts. So basically, it's kind of like our brain functioning, and the stuff that we need from school is our cognition. So cognitive development was discussed largely by Jean Piaget, who will figure prominently in your developmental psychology course. But we don't start out being able to think like adults. So Jean Piaget studied the errors in cognition made by children in order to understand in what ways they think differently than adults. So you'll see that, for example, when making plurals of certain words, like they learn rules. Like, for example, when something is plural, when there's more than one, you put an S on it. So you often hear kids around the age of 4 saying mouses instead of mice, because they've learned that in order to make something plural, you add an S on the end. So you'll see, there's errors below in understanding relative size. So I've seen this in my kids. So like the little girl on the left is trying to slide down a miniature slide. She doesn't quite get that she's too big for that, and trying to sit in a miniature car. I've seen my son do that several times. So Jean Piaget talked about developmental schemas. So an infant's mind works hard to make sense of our experiences in the world, and they organize this through what's called schemas. And these are mental containers we build to hold our experiences. Schemas can take the form of images, models, or concepts. So, if you look at the example at the bottom, the child has formed a schema of what a cow is, that it's a large animal, generally brown with ears. So when he sees a moose, which just somewhat resembles a cow, he calls a moose a cow. He hasn't learned to differentiate the cow yet. But then we talk about assimilation and accommodation. So a girl learns about what a dog is, and she has a dog schema, and how does she then do it when encountering a cat? So a cat looks similar to a dog, so initially she would probably call the dog a cat, or so that would be assimilation, and you learn one thing and then you apply it to something else, not necessarily correctly. But then she can accommodate her animal schema by separating cat or even different types of dogs into different schemas. So as a child grows and develops, they will learn that there's a big dog schema, a little dog schema, and that dogs and cats are different. So that's the process of what's called accommodation. So Jean Piaget believed that cognitive development is a combination of both nature and nurture. So they grow both by maturation as well as learning through play in the environment. And it's not a continuous process. Piaget was very much a proponent of the stage theory of development, which we discussed last week. So he believed both in stages and, he believed in stages and then both in nature and nurture. So he developed different stages. The first, from birth to nearly 2 years, is the sensory motor stage, where the child experiences the world through their senses. They learn about object permanence, which is they remember things are there, and they learn to be afraid of people they don't know. Between the ages of 2 and 7 is a pre-operational stage, where they start representing things with words and images, and they use intuitive rather than logical reasoning. So they start engaging in pretend play, and they're egocentric, that the world revolves very much around them. Between the ages of 7 to 11 is the concrete operational stage, where kids learn to think logically about concrete events. They can grasp analogies and perform mathematical equations. This is where they kind of have conservation, when you pour water from different sizes of glasses, and they understand that it's the same amount of water, and they can do mathematical transformations. They can do more complex math problems. From age 12 through adulthood is the formal operational stage, where they can start thinking abstractly about things. And that's when they have abstract logic, and they can also engage in moral reasoning, so they can understand the morality behind certain behaviors. Whereas when they're younger, it's more kind of the right and wrong type of reasoning. So the first stage, according to Piaget, is the sensory motor stage. So that's from birth to about 2 years. So the kid learns about object permanence. So that's when you play kids like peekaboo. Kids sometimes, when they're very little, think the object has gone away when they can't see it, but soon they'll learn to look for it. Like my son, who is 22 months, will pull my hands away when we're playing peekaboo because he knows mommy is behind the hands, or he'll take a blanket away from a toy because he knows the toy is underneath. See, so here she's learning to play by herself, peekaboo. So can children think abstractly? Jean Piaget felt that kids in the sensory motor stage did not think abstractly. Yet there's some evidence that kids in this stage can notice violations in physics, such as gravity. Does that mean that babies are doing physics? So babies stare longer and with surprise when numbers don't make sense. Is this math? Was Jean Piaget wrong? If so, then kids in the sensory motor stage do math. What can kids do in the pre-operational stage? Represent their schema and even some feelings with words and images. They use visual models to represent other places and perform pretend play. So you can see the kids in the right are playing doctor. And they can picture other points of view, replacing egocentrism with theory of mind, so they can see things from other people's perspective. They can use intuition, but not yet logic or abstract thinking. So egocentrism, I am the world. What mistake is this boy making? Do you have a brother? Yes, Jim. Does Jim have a brother? No, because he can't really see from Jim's perspective that he's his brother. And I see that very much with my 3.5-year-old, because he very much relates the world to himself, but not through his brother's perspective. So maturing beyond egocentrism is developing a theory of mind. So theory of mind refers to the ability to understand that others have their own thoughts and perspectives. So this is Sally, this is Anne. Sally puts her ball in the red cupboard. Sally goes away. Anne moves the ball to the blue cupboard. Where will Sally look for the ball? With a theory of mind, you can picture that Sally will have the wrong idea about where the ball is. And then she'll eventually find it in the other ones. So examples of operations that pre-operational children cannot do yet. So I mentioned earlier conservation. It refers to the ability to understand that a quantity is conserved and doesn't change even when arranged in different shapes. So you can see a little girl who looks like to be about 3 or 4 years old has 2 glasses of milk. And then one of those glasses is poured into a taller cup. And we know there's the same volume of liquid there, but because the volume, it looks higher in the taller cup because it's thinner. When asked again which one has more, she's pointing to the taller cup, so she doesn't understand conservation yet. And if you ask a child in the pre-operational stage which row has more mice, they're going to say the top row because it appears longer, but they don't understand that the distance really makes it, even though they're the same number. So talking about autism spectrum disorders, children with a disorder on the autism spectrum have difficulty in 3 general areas: establishing mutual social interaction, using language and play symbolically, and displaying flexibility with routines, interest, and behavior. Kids with disorders on the autism spectrum have more difficulty than typical children in mentally mirroring the thoughts and actions of others, and this typically has been discussed as mind blindness. So how do we teach this social emotional understanding to kids with autism? So we show them different pictures. So after there are different interventions that you can make, and after the intervention, kids with autism become better able to identify which emotion matches the context than kids who didn't receive the intervention and who were typically developing. So you can definitely teach these skills to kids with autism. So are they learning to understand the emotions of others, or are they memorizing that certain facial positions correspond to certain emotional words? It's really still unclear. Some people would speculate the latter, but I think there's evidence to suggest that about 40% of kids who are diagnosed in childhood with autism will lose that diagnosis by the time they reach school age. So it's unclear if these are kids who would have learned to develop these things anyway. The concrete operational stage begins at the ages of 6 to 7, around first grade to age 11. So kids can now grasp conservation and other concrete transformations. They can also understand simple mathematical equations and reversing them. So 3 plus 10 equals 3 plus 7 equals 10, and 10 minus 7 equals 3. At the formal operational stage, which is ages 11 plus, you start to understand analogies. Like my brain is like a computer in the concrete operational stage. In the formal operational stage, there's allegorical thinking, such as people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. I am horrible with these things, and I still don't understand half of these idiomatic expressions, but understanding that this is a comment on hypocrisy, and so understanding the more abstract meaning behind them. So this is when you can start to do algebra and solve for x. If you try to do this earlier, kids are generally not going to understand. So does logical reasoning begin earlier? Kids that Jean Piaget considered too young for logic can correctly answer, if John is in school, then Mary is in school. John is in school. What can you say about Mary? So Mary is also in school. Is this formal reasoning, or is it simply following a world pattern? To find out, it might be interesting to test at what age a child would be able to answer these tougher logic questions. I have to try this out with my 6-year-old, but I have to say that I think that she'd be able to answer that correctly. John is not in school. What can you say about Mary? Mary is in school. What can you say about John? Mary is not in school. What can you say about John? I'm going to try that with her tonight. Reassessment of Jean Piaget's theory using models, so symbolic thinking. There is some evidence that 3-year-olds can use tiny model of a room as a map, helping them to picture the location of objects in a full-size room. Does this mean that 3-year-olds' ability mean that Piaget was wrong? Do kids use symbolic thought much earlier than suggested? Although Jean Piaget's observation and stage theory are useful, today's researchers believe that development is a continuous process, that kids can show some mental abilities and operations at earlier ages than Piaget thought, and formal logic is a small part of cognition even for adults than people believe. So Lev Vygotsky is another developmentalist, and he was kind of an alternative to Piaget. He studied children, but he worked on their social communication. And so his principle was that children learn thinking skills by internalizing language from others and developing inner speech. So put the big block on the bottom and not the top. So he saw development as a scaffold, of mentoring, language, and cognitive support from parents and others. And I see my son, I hear him at night, he's processing the stuff that he learned during the day, and he's talking. He's 3 years old now, and he talks to himself and repeats what we say in order for himself to process. So stranger anxiety develops around the age of 9 to 13 months. And at this point, kids start to learn that, there are strangers outside of their parents. So how does this develop? So as kids develop schemas for primary people in their lives, like mommy and daddy and maybe grandma, grandpa, and babysitter, they start to notice when there are strangers that don't fit into those schemas. But they can't necessarily assimilate those faces yet. So why does this develop? An evolutionary psychologist would note that children are learning to walk at these stages, and some children who walk toward unfamiliar creatures might have died before a chance to pass on their genes. So it's kind of, from an evolutionary perspective, it's important for them to stay away from things that are foreign to them. So also in the social developmental area, we have attachment. So attachment refers to the emotional tie to another person. In kids, the attachment is the desire for closeness to a caregiver. So if you recall, some of you might be reading about this experiment as part of your research summaries, but the origin of attachment suggests that that experiments with monkeys suggest that attachment is based on physical affection and comfortable body contact and not based on being rewarded by food. So they found that a monkey wanted to stay much more with an object that was warm and cuddly, the fake mommy monkey on the right, as opposed to the one on the left, which was wire but also provided food. But when the monkey felt kind of scared, he went to the mommy. So this was John Bowlby who did these experiments. And if you're more interested, those are one of the research summaries that you can do. So what are the origins of attachment? Familiarity. Most creatures tend to attach to caregivers who've become familiar. So familiarity is through contact. So birds have a critical period, the hours after hatching, during which they may imprint. This means they might become rigidly attached to the first moving object they see. So you can see that the birds in this example imprinted on this plane, and therefore they're following this plane around. Lorenz was the researcher who discovered this. So kids have different ways of dealing with separation. The degree and style of parent-child attachment has been tested by Mary Ainsworth, in the strange situation test. In this test, the child is observed as the mother and child are alone in an unfamiliar room, and then the child explores the room as the mother sits, and then a stranger enters the room and talks to the mother and approaches the child, and then the mother leaves the room. And then after a few minutes, the mother returns. So kids who are securely attached, about 60%, feel distress when the mother leaves and seek contact with her when she returns. Kids that are insecurely attached cling to the mother. They're less likely to explore the environment and might get loudly upset with the mother's departure and remain upset when she returns. Kids with insecure attachment with the avoidance style seem indifferent to the mother's departure and return. So what causes these different attachment styles? Is it nature or nurture? Is it an inborn temperament, or is it caused by parental behavior? So temperament refers to the person's characteristic style intensity of emotional reactivity. Some kids have an easy temperament, that they're happy, relaxed, and calm, and they have predictable rhythms of need to eat and sleep. And some infants are more difficult. They're more irritable and unpredictable in their needs and behavior. So my first child, my daughter, was a little bit more difficult, although now she's very easy. But she was very strongly attached to me. It was very hard for her to separate. My third son had a very easy temperament and was very happy, calm, and relaxed. Mary Ainsworth believed that sensitive response, calm parenting is correlated with secure attachment style. And monkeys with unresponsive artificial mothers showed anxious, secure attachment. So part of this could be related to parenting behavior. So training in sensitive responding for parents who are temperamentally difficult children led to double the rates of secure attachments. There are definitely parental behaviors that can continue. So it seems like it's a nature-nurture interaction like most of the things we do. And we've talked a lot about mothers, but fathers count too. So many of the studies' impact of parenting have focused on mothers, but correlational studies show a strong relationship between the parental father involvement in parenting and child's academic success, their health, and overall psychological well-being. Now, Now, with the advent of mothers working outside of the home, there's a lot of talk about the focus on daycare. So, what are some of the effects on the environment and attachment? Separation anxiety peaks and fades whether kids are at home or in the daycare. So, it seems to peak sometime around 14 months and then decreases as kids get a little bit older. So, it's not just about bonding with the parents, but Eric Erickson, who's another developmental researcher, talked about the basic trust, which resembles the concept of attachment but extends beyond the feelings of family to whether we feel the world is a predictable and trustworthy place. Attachment style may be relevant to our ability to manage and enjoy adult relationships. It may even be relevant to our motivations to achieve and avoid risk. So if they feel like the world is a safe place, they're more apt to go out and explore. And so Eric Erickson believed that basic trust is established by relationships with early caregivers. And he wasn't sure if it was set by genetics, formed by early experiences, shaped with new experiences. So basically, a lot of the researchers found it's kind of all of the above. So kids, if they live without safe, nurturing, affectionate caretaking, they may still be resilient. So they may bounce back and achieve. However, if the kid has prolonged deprivation or abuse, they may have difficulty forming attachments, have increased anxiety and depression, and have lowered intelligence and show increased aggression. So this is kind of if they've been abused, neglected in childhood quite severely. So fortunately, kids for the most part are quite resilient. Kids in daycare, we've already seen that daycare doesn't significantly increase or decrease separation in anxiety, and warm interactions with multiple caregivers can result in multiple healthy attachments. So time in daycare correlates with advanced thinking skills, but also with increased aggression and defiance, because sometimes, there's so many kids fighting for certain caregivers, so it's hard for one caregiver to give so many kids attention. As children age too, they develop self-concept of who they are. One of the major tasks of infancy is to form healthy attachments with their caregiver, but one of the major tasks of childhood is to form a healthy self-concept, a stable and positive understanding of who they are. By age 8 to 10, a kid moves from that's me in the mirror to I have skills, preferences, and goals, and this prepares the child to be confident and successful. So as I mentioned, my daughter's 6 and she's already kind of in that phase. She told me she wants to be an engineer. So one of the things that they talk about a lot in the parenting literature is parenting styles. And you've probably heard about the authoritarian, the permissive, and the authoritative. So the authoritarian are the too hard parents. They're the ones that say, because I said so. Many of us probably had parents like that. The permissive ones were the ones that too easily succumb to kids' desires, not enforcing limits or standards for their children's behavior. And the authoritative parents are the ones that enforce rules, limits, and standards, but also explain, discuss, listen, and express respect for kids' ideas and wishes. And if you can kind of guess what the better outcomes are, one would hope that it would be the bottom one. So basically, authoritative parents, more than any of the other two styles, seem to be associated with high self-reliance, high social competence, high self-esteem, low aggression. But one of the questions is, are these results of parenting style, or are parents responding to the child's temperament, or are they a function of culture or genes? I would like to think that all of the above are interactive, and you want to always kind of show your child respect, but enforce kind of general guidelines and limitations and rules. So that's the